All right, so we should be good. And
Hi, Durin.
See you, Kei-Mu.
Good to see you.
Hi, Kei-Mu.
Hi, Trung. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Good, good. Hi, Jonathan.
all right.
Hi, Cecilia.
Hi, Kei-Mu. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. So Kim's back in charge again.
Oh, okay. You didn't like it? You didn't like being in charge?
It was uncomfortable for me to be in the spotlight.
Too much power for you, actually. Maybe you should kind of claw some of that back. And
But-
checks and balances of the organizational group. Yeah, so Kei-Mu will get started in about a minute. There's still a few more people logging on, so give them a couple more minutes. Give them another minute.
Sure.
The St. Patrick's Day colors going
Yeah, is that on purpose?
a little bit early, I guess.
A little early.
Never too early. Okay, so let's get started. Happy to have everybody back. For those of you who are new, the house rules are, if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute yourself and jump in. We'll also have Mike. You're going to be in the chat room, is that right? I'm going to volunteer Mike to be in the chat room.
Yes.
So if you have questions, you can also leave questions in the chat room, and Mike can respond or break in and make Kei-Mu answer them. Otherwise, Kei-Mu, you have an hour, and then we'll have time to keep the discussion going afterwards.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Thanks for inviting us to present our paper to the ITM. So this is joint with Mike Sposi, of course, and then Jing Zhang, unfortunately, has policy work responsibilities today, so cannot join us. And related to the Fed, the views expressed here are our own and not those of the Dallas or Chicago Feds or the Federal Reserve System. So our motivation is the broad increasing importance of global value chains. If we think about, say, the past half century, and there's a lot of facts that document that. And also there are some facts that are linking the increased global value chain participation to economic growth. So let me just cite a couple facts from Johnson and Nogueira's Restat paper. They found that the domestic value added embodied in gross exports declined from 82 to 69% between 1970 and 2007. The flip side of that number is the foreign value added embodied in gross exports almost doubled between going from 18 to 31% in this time period. So increasingly countries are importing inputs, using them in production, and then exporting some of their output. So this is one of the most highly cited facts about the increased global value chain participation in the world. And then in addition, their paper shows this association between those countries that grew more rapidly, between the country's economic growth and the change in their domestic content of exports. And basically the countries that grew more rapidly had a bigger fall in the domestic content of their exports. So again, the countries that grow more rapidly had increased global value chain participation. So these types of facts basically motivate what we want to do, which is in this broad context of trade integration over time, what are the linkages between global value chains and economic growth? So to address this question, we're basically going to build a model with global value chains following this sequential chain process with multi-stage production. And then we're also going to have capital accumulation. And our trade is going to be based on both Ricardian and Hexerlin comparative advantage. So then with this model, we're just going to do some exercises that look at the implications of trade integration for trade, of course, and then also for the global value chains, and finally for economic growth. And one of our main findings is going to be that this trade integration generates this two-way feedback from comparative advantage to global value chains and to capital accumulation, and then also from capital accumulation to comparative advantage and global value chains. So that's basically the motivation. There's, of course, a huge literature on global value chains, on growth. What we cite here are just two narrow literatures. So one on models of global value chains, and in particular, the snake models, the ones with sequential production. And we're going to build off of the one highlighted in blue, the Andras and Durgortari framework. And in this workshop, you've actually already seen a paper along those lines. Jo presented her job market paper, which used the same framework last December or November. And then the other related literature is on dynamic trade models. And in particular, we're thinking of those models that have capital accumulation in them. And the one that we're building off of in particular is the one that Mike has done with Ravi Kumar and Santa Creo. So essentially what we're doing is just marrying these two model frameworks together. So that's the plan. So that's the introduction. And so then for the rest of this talk, I'm just going to lay out the model, highlight a few of the key equations. And then I'm going to just show a series of numerical exercises with the model, first looking at some steady state implications and then some dynamic implications, including dynamic welfare implications. So that's the plan for the talk.
Kei-Mu, if I remember correctly, the Ravi Kumar, Santa Creo and Sposi have a level effect of trade. Maybe I'm wrong, but you're emphasizing trade and growth.
No, they have growth in there. Okay. So their framework it's essentially a big dynamic Eaton-Corda model, and where capital accumulation is a big force in there. Ours, frankly, it's a slightly simplified version of their model. They have a distinction between investment goods and consumption goods, and here investment goods and consumption goods are the same. But
yeah, so international trade is going to increase growth through the incentives for agents to save and accumulate more capital.
Yeah, so the main mechanism is that when trade increases because of lower trade barriers, through the selection effects and specialization effects, the effective TFP of the economy is going to be higher. And that's like then the marginal product of capital is higher, and that's going to create incentives to accumulate capital. So I'll show that later. I'm going to show an Euler equation later, and I'll show that.
But there's no long run growth effects. This is just a transition, right? That's all.
Correct. Correct. There's no long run growth.
For spelling out my question.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. This is all transitional growth. That's right. There's no long run growth.
Nice.
All right. So here's the overview of the model. We want to keep it pretty simple. So we just have two countries and one sector, and then there's a continuum of varieties in this one sector. And then each of these varieties is made in two sequential stages. And then the production process involves labor and capital for each stage. And then this downstream stage, the second stage, is also going to require the upstream output as an input into its production process. And I'll provide more detail on that in the next slide. And then, as is true with all the classical and neoclassical trade models, each country has technologies for producing all stages of all varieties. And it's going to be the Ricardian and Heckscher-Ohlin comparative advantage forces that determine which country makes which share of each stage for purchase by each country. And then the dynamics are just going to come through from a representative household that's choosing consumption and investment paths over time. Okay, so a lot of the
Kei-Mu, just a modeling assumption. Why are you thinking about there not being any kind of trade dynamics in the trade elasticity?
I'm not sure what you mean.
I mean, so
We're going to have trade. We're going to have trade dynamics.
no, but I mean, it's the trade elasticity here is going to be constant in the model you're going to write down, right?
We're going to have parameters that are very linked to the trade elasticity, and those parameters are constant, but I don't think the trade elasticity is going to be constant. We haven't calculated that, but it's pretty straightforward to calculate.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I think the trade elasticity is going to vary according to the trade cost.
Okay.
All right, so a lot of the action is going to come through this production function, but first, and I should say, we try to use as much of the Antras and de Guattari notation as possible. So a production chain is going to be denoted by this cursive L, and in our simple framework with just two stages of production, what the chain is just the location of stage 1 production and then the location of stage 2 production. So a simple world of two countries and two stages of production, there are 4 possible production chains. There are 4 possible L's to make a particular variety. And then following the Antras and de Guattari paper, we're going to use this lead firm metaphor to think about these production chains. And kind of their key idea that allowed them to map these multi-stage production models into the Eaton-Cordham rubric was to basically say that each possible production chain has a Frechet productivity associated with it. So they didn't get into the details of this stage is this productivity, that stage is that productivity. They just have each production chain has one Frechet productivity associated with it. And that's going to be embodied in this equation 1. So let me spend a couple minutes here on this equation. So this production function. So it's a nested Cobb-Douglas. So that's Cobb-Douglas in value added and intermediates. And so gamma S is the share of value added in stage S. And for simplicity, we're going to say that the value added share in stage 1 is 1. So in other words, the upstream stage is 100% value added. And only the second stage, the downstream stage, is there an intermediate good. That's captured by M, this M right here. And the key thing here is this M is a specialized input. It's particular to this variety new, and it comes from the stage 1 production of this variety new. So a simple metaphor is automobile tires are used only to make automobiles. They don't have any other use in the economy. So, so that's one part of this production function. The second part is the value added, which is Cobb-Douglas in capital and labor. Labor here is denoted by H. And then we have the capital intensity or the capital share, alpha, also with the superscript S. And so we're going to allow the capital intensities to vary across stages of production. And so that's going to be a source of this Heckscher-Ohlin motive for trade. We only have one sector, but we're going to have 2 stages. And it's the different capital intensities across the stages that will be this, provide part of the Heckscher-Ohlin mechanism. The third thing I wanted to mention are the productivity terms. We actually have two productivity terms. The capital A, it's sort of like the usual TFP term in a growth model. It's going to be stage, and country and time specific. And so it's going to be common across all the varieties. So that's one term. And then we're going to have the Frechet term, the little a here, that is specific to the entire production chain. So you'll see the index here is L. So it's common for all the stages in this production chain. And this parameter will have the usual variance parameter theta associated with it. Okay, so you see a lot of that action just comes from the nature of this production function. And we're going to have trade, of course, subject to frictions. We'll have the usual iceberg frictions denoted by the letter D, and they could be stage specific. And we have this from to notation. So trade costs from country I to country N. And in all cases, they'll be greater than one, except when you're trading within a country.
Kei-Mu, can you just remind me like what's special about using this framework versus just a roundabout production framework?
Yeah, so in a lot of our exercises, or in some of our exercises, we show the distinctions between them. And so it will come out there. And in one of the key equations I'm going to show too, I think it shows some of that also. But yeah, roundabout would have this generic intermediate that would be like a composite of all the other goods. So here we're kind of doing the other extreme. It's a very specialized input that is specific to this variety. And then a more general functional form, and I did this in a paper with Eunhee Lee recently, is we had a mixture of this specialized input and roundabout production.
Kei-Mu, the other
Yes.
trend that has been going on since in this period, right, from the 70s to now, are changes in the shares of labor, capital, profit, and inputs, intermediate inputs. Did you think about allowing for some substitution between them instead of fixed factor shares?
Yeah, so I think a way to do that would be to deviate from Cobb-Douglas, go to CES. And as you might have seen, there's even non-homothetic CES production functions running around these days. And so I think you would need to do something like that. But right now we're punting on that, on being consistent with that fact. So I've kind of covered this already, but the Ricardian comparative advantage is going to come about from the two technology terms, the country, stage, time specific term, and then the Frechet term. They're both going to jointly determine the Ricardian comparative advantage. And then the Heckscher-Lin comparative advantage involves two features. One is the capital intensity differences across stages, and then you also need capital labor ratios to differ across countries. Then you'll have Heckscher-Lin type trade. And then we're going to assume balanced trade period by period, so we don't have current account or trade imbalances. So by the time you've done the stage 2 production, you're going to have this continuum of stage 2 goods, and then we're just going to aggregate them in this usual way. A CES, with the CES aggregator, we come up with a composite good capital Q, and then that is going to be used for consumption and investment. So that's the lead into the macro side of the model, and this is very standard. We just have a representative household in each country, choosing paths of consumption and investment to maximize this infinite horizon utility function written in per capita terms, and then weighted by the number of members of this household. And then the budget constraint is, spending is equal to income from capital and labor. And implicit, of course, in this budget constraint is that you cannot borrow and lend from other countries. And then capital is accumulated in the usual way. So that's the setup of the model, and where the key features are that production function, the Frechet assumptions, the lead firm way that we got the Frechet into there, and then this kind of standard dynamics. So I want to now present three key equations, two on this slide. So one is, your standard Euler equation. Per capita consumption growth is linked to the incentive to delay consumption for a year. And I just want to highlight this R over P term, because when you open up to trade, this P term is going to fall for two reasons. So this is the price index, the national price index, and it's going to fall because trade costs are lower. That's kind of a direct effect. And then there's this indirect effect through selection and specialization that's going to also lead P to fall. And so I think of this as an increase in the effective total factor productivity of the economy. That's going to lead to capital accumulation, which will drive down this R. And there'll be enough capital accumulation until R, which obviously is connected to the marginal product of capital, until R falls by as much as P does. And then you're kind of back to your original steady state R over P. So that's the link between trade and transitional path growth through this Euler equation. Then the other main equation in the model is this GVC sourcing share equation. And this is the analog to the pi equation from Eaton and Cordon, where the pi equation would be on spending shares. This is on GVC shares. It's this lambda on the left-hand side is the share of varieties produced by a particular chain L and then purchased by country N in period T. And relative to the usual, and want to focus on the numerator, relative to the usual Eaton-Cordon term, where there's kind of a cost term in the main parentheses, and then it's raised to the negative theta, there are two things that are different. So first, there's this gamma tilde term. Gamma tilde is the share of gross output in the final gross value of the good at stage S. And this is increasing as you move downstream. So basically, this gamma tilde captures the fact that trade costs, a given trade cost, has more impact as you move further downstream. And it's because the downstream good, in some sense, has more weight or economic mass as it moves towards the completed good. So that's one part that's new. And then the other part that's new is this product here. It's doing the product across all the stages. So in principle, you could have capital S D terms, and if you have this back and forth trade, all those D terms will be greater than 1. So that's the source of this magnification effect that you can get from these frameworks. So this is a partial equilibrium analysis. The denominator you can think of as the general equilibrium term. This is very much connected to the price level. And the overall effect of changes in trade costs on these shares, obviously depends on both the partial equilibrium intuition and the GE effect.
Kei-Mu, sorry to keep
Yes.
on interrupting you, but I don't know if your points are going to be only qualitatively or if you're going to want to quantitatively get at some fact in the data. And if it's quantitative, then we know from the other Eaton-Cordon that only a few countries have a comparative advantage in producing capital goods. And in your framework, intermediate input or consumption goods and capital goods have the same price independently of trade costs. Is it tractable to relax that? And isn't that a concern for quantitative analysis?
I mean, I'll defer to Mike, but in Mike's paper with Anna Maria and Ravi, they did have these distinct capital and consumption goods. So they did it, they have the know-how, the TFP to do it. So I have a feeling we could probably do it too. One thing I'll say though is since the time that Eaton and Cordum did that paper, the set of countries that export capital goods has really increased. And so, for example, China is now exporting capital goods. So it's a little different. It's a broader landscape now in terms of capital goods trade than before. But the other answer to your question is, to paraphrase my former Minneapolis colleagues, this is a toy model. It's just all qualitative. There's no quantitative stuff here. And we could talk a little bit about that at the end. So the domestic content of exports, we want to calculate the model version of this and compare it to the data counterparts because we have all these papers by Rob Johnson, Guillermo Noguera, also Koopman, Wang, and Wei, and others, and computing empirical measures of value-added exports. So we have our model-based measure. And I'm going to kind of skip this slide because the actual calculation is slightly different from what we have here. But yeah, I'm just going to skip this. But we basically compute this in the model, and we'll compare it to a couple of pictures of data later. Okay, so that's it for the model and the key equations. Now I'm just going to show some results. First, steady state, then transition dynamics. And then with the transition dynamics, we're going to first look at symmetric countries and then some asymmetric countries. So this is the steady state import share of absorption. Snake is our model, our baseline GVC model. And then Spider is the, these numbers here are the steady state import to absorption ratios for an Eaton-Cordum, a dynamic Eaton-Cordum model. And the rows are the import shares of absorption for different trade costs, where one, of course, is frictionless trade. 8 corresponds to 700% trade costs.
So
Just
And
one
this
question
suggests that
here.
the trade elasticities are different across the two models?
so the thetas, I think the thetas are the same, but the implicit
Yeah, the trade
elasticities, yeah, the implicit elasticities are different.
Why aren't you choosing the theta so that the models are on even footing?
Well, in some sense they are, in the sense of by the time you get to free trade, they're going to have the same import to absorption ratio. So in terms of going from autarky to free trade, you connect the 2 points at the end, they're going to be the same. But it's the path to get to the end that's going to be different. And that's what I wanted to highlight.
Yeah, that's not the ACR point though, right? It's when you make the trade elasticity the same across different, when you have different models and different trade elasticities, you have to kind of put them on even footing. So I just
well, right, there's the whole question of what is the even footing, and I mean that's a subtle question. And so one way of doing an even footing is having the frictionless trade share be the same. Another is, as you said, maybe have the trade elasticity be the same. But in this setting, the trade elasticity is not, as I said, there's not a simple formula for it. So there is a simple formula for these GVC shares, but then you have got to do that mapping into the import share of absorption. But the main point I want to highlight here is that with high trade costs in our global value chain model, you start to get increases in trade, even while in kind of the standard model, trade is very low. Basically, in the standard model, all of the increase in trade occurs, when trade costs are less than 100%, whereas in the snake model, in the GVC model, you have some increase in trade, as I said, when the trade costs are high. And this is just a revealed preference way of saying that you're going to have these larger gains from trade because trade is happening even when the trade costs are several 100%. So this is one way in which the two models, a roundabout model would differ from a global value chain model. And then I want to formalize this welfare point. with this welfare comparison across, we have an equation for welfare across two steady states where C is consumption. So this is like per capita consumption. 2 stars means free trade, and then 1 star means autarky. And then this lambda term, it's lambda with this subscript ln. Ln means the global value chain where all stages are made in country N, in like the home country. So obviously in autarky, this lambda share is going to be 1. All of the chains of production will involve value added produced within the country. And then this lambda double star will be the share of all the global value chains involving value added entirely within the home country under free trade. So this number will obviously be less than 1. And to get a sense of what this number would be, let's just think of a world of like n-symmetric countries. And then basically the share of global value chains that involve all the value added produced in the home country is just going to be 1 over n to the s. So in a simple world of 2 countries in 2 stages of production, it's going to be 1/4. And that's less than 1/2. 1/2 is what you'd get in the standard Eaton-Corda model. So this fraction is going to be lower in the global value chain model compared to a standard Eaton-Corda model. And then it's raised to this negative power. So then you get, you're going to get greater gains from trade, just because intuitively there are just more opportunities for specialization. That's really what's going on here.
The question, you say in the 2 standard one and well, I guess it's snakes versus spider, you're using the same theta, right?
Yeah, we're using the same theta. Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't you infer that, from what you said before, that to match the trade shares, the trade costs would have to be much higher in the snake model?
Yeah, that's what this thing shows. Yeah, to match a trade share of like 1.4% in the snake model, you need the D equals 5, but here would be like in the spider model, it would be 3.
But here, when you're doing the welfare comparison, are you doing it with the same iceberg costs, or are you letting the iceberg costs match the trade shares? Given the trade?
So in this comparison, the free trade, again, we're kind of, it's Duran will remember, this is what Tim Kehoe calls Star Wars. It's the star, and Kim will know this too, is we're just doing autarky to free trade. We're doing those 2 extremes. And in free trade, you're going to have the same import share to absorption in these 2 settings. So, but you're right, a different calculation, we should do the calculation that you implicitly have in mind. But
A related question that arises is that people generally think, since McCollum, that the trade costs that we infer from the data are very high. So we put in for search frictions, et cetera, to kind of justify such a high trade costs. And what this model is saying is that no, the trade costs that we've been backing out are even smaller than the true ones, right?
Yes. So that's a good question. From this, the answer would be yes. But I have this other paper on the border effect where I argue that the nominal trade costs don't have to be as high as what would be implied by like an Anderson and Van Winkop analysis, because in the presence of multi-stage production, the effective trade costs are higher. So you're right. I've got to reconcile that intuition with the results from that table. we need to do that. But the main point is that, as I said, the core intuition is very straightforward, just that with multiple stages of production where you can just break them apart, there's just more opportunities for specialization. And that's really the source of the greater gains compared to a standard model where you're only trading like the final goods. And then another point is just this capital contribution, that it's linked to the parameter alpha. And obviously the greater the capital intensity of production, the greater the gains as well, because there's this additional capital accumulation. All right, so now let me turn to the transition dynamics. And so we're just going to do a couple of exercises. One is,
Before
yeah.
you do that, I guess I'm still a little bit stuck on a couple things. One is this ACR point, and the other is, are you saying that when you go to this other model, like the ratio of gross output to value added is higher?
No. So in the exercises that we do, especially when we compare our model to like a roundabout model, we make sure that the ratios of value added to gross output are the same in both, in like the new steady state.
So then I didn't get the statement about like in one model it's 1/2, the other model it's 1/4. Maybe
because this is not this is not direct. This has a mapping to the import share, but it's not exactly the import share, right? This is the share of varieties produced by a particular global value chain, by a particular production chain. And each chain has its own implication for an import share. So you've got to calculating the import share kind of requires you to figure out, what fraction of varieties are purchased according to which chain, and then you calculate the imports for each chain.
okay.
And so then
I guess, we're all looking at these formulas. That looks a lot like the ACR formula.
this is like this is an ACR type
exactly
formula.
right. And so then I was kind of puzzled why we weren't doing like comparing models that had the kind of same elasticities. But then you said this thing about the lambdas being very, very different. And so I guess I'm still kind of, I'll probably have to talk to you about it later. I can't quite see why this model should have bigger gains than the other model still.
Yeah, it's the so you don't buy this intuition that it really goes back to Adam Smith and the pin factory. There's just more opportunities to specialize. That's the source of the gains.
Right, but Eaton Cordon have that by having more dispersed shocks, right? And there's always like a mapping.
Yeah, there's many ways to get more gains. You could have this lower theta. That's right here.
Right, so that's what I was trying to figure out. Like if the Di Cortare Antras paper is really just putting more dispersion in shocks, then isn't there a way of doing that also in the standard Eaton Cordon that would kind of put them on even footing?
In the way Antras and De Guattari did it, they actually wanted to control for this dispersion of shock. So that's this whole gamma tilde business is a way to not effectively introduce a smaller theta. So, if you read their paper, that's kind of why they introduced this extra element there.
Yeah, okay.
A quick question on notation. What does LN represent?
So LN represents a particular production chain in which all the stages are made in country N. So basically, it's like an autarky chain. All the stages are made in country N, and then it's consumed in country N.
So Kei-Mu, this is going to reveal my complete ignorance about everything regarding the literature, but I'll ask it anyways. So suppose someone came into your model and they didn't know about global value chains at all, and they try to fit a model to this that ignored the GVC, and they did this by estimating sigma, and that would give you some kind of ACR measure of welfare gains, right? That sigma is going to be the key thing. Would they get a different sigma than what you're using, or the same sigma, or?
Yeah, so, you know, one of my older papers that was kind of about this point, that if you just took a framework without multiple stages of production, without these production chains, you're going to get a sigma, like a big sigma. That's the only way you could explain the rapid
Right.
growth of trade.
Exactly.
And then with the big sigma, I mean, here would be a big theta. You know, you're just not going to have that large gains from trade. And what I showed in that paper is you don't need such a big sigma if you allow production to be fragmented internationally. So you could explain the growth of trade, yeah, without having as large of a sigma or theta.
Okay.
So, and then the import of that is that the gains could be correspondingly larger.
Well, thanks.
One thing I should say is in those settings, it's not quite the Antras and Durgotari setting, because there I had a Frechet at every stage of production. So I had to solve it in this Neanderthal way of discrete, you know, I had 1 million goods and I solved for each of those 1 million goods, like where it was produced. And what we don't know yet is there a legitimate difference? Is there a qualitative or quantitative difference between that type of framework and the Antras and Durgotari framework? Okay, so let me turn to these transition dynamic exercises where the first one involves two symmetric countries. And the basic idea is they're going to start from an autarky steady state. They have the same TFP, the same capital labor ratio. And then we're just going to announce this 50-year decline in trade costs of at a certain rate per year. And then after 50 periods, that decline in trade costs ends. And then what we want to see is the dynamics in the global value chains and the standard macro dynamics as a result of this. This is like the main exogenous shock. So basically, we're going to have these trade costs decline 3% a year, and that's going to take the trade costs from roughly 700% down to 70%. And then the other parameters I wanted to highlight are the fact that stage 1 is capital intensive and stage 2 is labor intensive. It's not going to be relevant for this exercise because the two countries have the same capital labor ratios, so there won't be heteroline forces, but in the next exercise with asymmetric countries, this difference will be relevant. So this picture shows the prevalence or the share of varieties purchased according to each of the 4 production chains. So there's one panel for each production chain. And just in terms of notation, chain 2,1 means the first stage is made in country 2, and then the second stage is made in country 1. And because they're two symmetric countries, we can just focus on country 1, which is in red. And you'll see a red solid line and a red dashed line. The red solid line is our model, and then the red dashed line is a dynamic Eaton-Korda model. And so the first thing to notice is I'm going to call this the autarky chain, where all the value added is produced in the country that purchases the good. You see that share of varieties produced by this chain, it falls more in this trade integration exercise than in a standard Eaton-Korda model. And at one level, it's obvious because there's 3 other possibilities to bring in foreign value added in our framework, whereas in a standard Eaton-Korda model, there's only one other possibility where the good is made entirely in the foreign country, in the second country. And then in particular, it's this chain 2-1 that rises the most when trade costs decline. Chain 2-1 is where, as I said before, stage 1 is made in country 2, and then country 1 imports that intermediate good, and then it adds value added in stage 2, and then it's consumed in country 1. So of these 3 chains that have country 2's value added, this chain, 2,1, is the one that has the least amount of trade costs associated with it. So then it's the one that expands the most when there's a trade integration. The chain that you associate like with back and forth trade is this chain 1-2, where country 1 makes stage 1, country 2 makes stage 2, and then it's exported back to country 1. That's captured by this red line. And you see it increases, but even when the trade costs are 70%, it's still not a large share. It's in the single digits of all the global value, of all the production chains.
Kei-Mu, if you kept going, that upper right one would start taking off, I guess, right? If you've gone
Exactly.
down to like 10% trade costs or something.
Yeah, exactly. And if we went, there's enough symmetry here that if we went to frictionless trade, each of these red lines would wind up at 0.25. So they would all be like 1/4 of all the global value chains. So as you said, Sam, this from when the trade costs go from 70% to 0, this is the one that's going to take off. Okay, now let me show the growth pictures, and there's 6 variables here: capital, investment, consumption, etc. But in the interest of time, I just want to focus on the top left panel, capital. The y-axis is log units, and then time is on the x-axis. And then the blue line is the dynamics of the capital accumulation in our framework, and then the dashed line is in the Eaton-Korda dynamic Eaton-Korda model. And so there's just a couple of takeaways here. So the first is we have more capital accumulation in this GVC model. And again, it's coming from the fact that the increased opportunities for selection and specialization effectively raise the aggregate TFP by more, and that's going to induce more capital accumulation. And then the second point I want to make, and of course this is common to all growth models, is the capital accumulation continues even after the trade integration stops. The trade integration stops in period 50, but you still see capital accumulation continuing. But that's standard from the neoclassical growth model. Like you have a TFP shock in period 1, and then the capital dynamics after that continue, literally forever as you asymptote to the steady state. The final point I just want to make quickly is if you look at the dynamic Eaton-Korda model, the capital stock actually declines a little bit for a few periods before it starts to increase. And the reason is there's this sort of trade-off. It's this related to the perfect foresight assumption. We announced today that trade costs are going to be declining 3% a year for the next 50 years. So in each period, there's this level effect of the lower trade costs, which would induce more capital accumulation. But then there's this incentive effect to wait a period until the trade costs are even lower in the future. And so that's an incentive to delay the capital accumulation. And then for the parameters we've chosen in this dynamic Eaton-Korda model, the delaying effect actually dominates initially, whereas in our global value chain framework, the level effect dominates initially. But the main point is there's just greater capital accumulation in our setting because of the increased TFP.
Kei-Mu?
Yeah.
Can I ask
Hi,
a question?
Yeah, hi, Ben.
Are you allowing capital to move between sectors?
Yeah, capital is moving between sectors, not between countries, but between sectors. Well, there are no sectors. It's moving between the stages of production. There's only one sector, but there's the 2 stages of production, and capital is moving between them.
Okay, so I'm surprised that doesn't induce a little bit more of a jump. As you shut down the plants in Detroit and move production to Mexico, shouldn't you see if you can use that capital for other things?
But
once you liberalize, there should be a quick allocation from all the plants that are going to shut down under the new equilibrium to plants that are going to expand it in the new equilibrium. unless I'm
Yeah, no,
Yes.
so I think.
unless I'm
I think
misunderstanding something.
Oh, I think that's a good point. I mean, these are two symmetric countries, but your metaphor is basically does carry over. But I think what's going on is it is because of this perfect foresight thing where the trade costs are going to be much lower in the future. If this is a one-time reduction in the trade costs, I think you'll see this much bigger effect in the initial period, like the one you're talking about. Okay. Why don't I go on? So this sort of summarizes what I've been saying, and then I just want to reiterate, because these countries are symmetric, even though we have the capital intensity differences across stages of production, we do not have capital labor ratio differences across countries. So there are no Heckscher-Lin forces. So let's bring in these Heckscher-Lin forces by going to two asymmetric countries. And this is the exercise that we're going to do. We're going to have the two countries start out in autarky again, but one country has like half the TFP and commensurately lower capital stock than the other country in the initial steady state. Then we're going to have the same trade integration as before with this path of 3% per year lower trade costs. But in addition, we're going to have this TFP convergence where the more poor country is going to have TFP growth in such a way that after 50 periods, it catches up to the richer country in its TFP. So that's the exercise here. They're asymmetric initially, but then the poor country has this catch up going on in terms of TFP. And then in the background, we have the same trade integration as before. So I want to first show the capital dynamics over time. And again, in the interest of time, I'll just focus on this, the panel with capital. And the red line corresponds to the country that had the lower TFP and capital stock initially, and then the blue line is the richer country initially. And then, of course, because of this higher TFP growth, the capital is going to grow at a more rapid rate, not only in the 50 periods of the TFP growth and the trade integration, but then even after the TFP catch-up is done and the trade integration stops, there's still capital accumulation over time. But again, this is just a continuation of just the standard intuition from a neoclassical growth model. But this capital and the capital labor ratio will catch up and eventually converge with that of the rich country, sometime out like around period 100. So keep this in mind, because this matters for some of the Heckscher-Lin action that's happening. So, so here I want to show the import share of absorption during this transition process. And the red line is country one, which is the initially poor country. And I want to just highlight three things here. So the initially poor country is smaller. So partly because it's smaller, it has a smaller share of world GDP, it's going to have a higher import share of absorption all along the transition until it converges with country two. And then, of course, they have the same import share. And then the second point, of course, is that as the trade integration occurs, both countries have an increase in this import share. And one of the mechanisms is this Heckscher-Lin mechanism. As long as the capital labor ratios differ between the two countries, that there will be this Heckscher-Lin motive for trade, where in particular country two, which is more capital intensive, they will specialize in the capital intensive stage, and country one will specialize more in the labor intensive stage. So the Heckscher-Lin mechanism underlies some of this trade growth. Then in period 50, the trade integration and the TFP catch-up shut down, and then you'll see the import share of absorption in country one actually decline. So it sort of overshoots its final steady state value. And this is for two reasons. The first is that country one, as I showed earlier with the capital accumulation, it's continuing to catch up in terms of capital. So country one as a share of world GDP continues to rise. And so by having bigger mass, it's going to have a smaller import share. And then the other reason is as the capital is catching up, the capital labor ratios are converging, and hence the motive for hexual-in trade is diminishing. And so for both these reasons, country one's import share declines. And by the time they converge, the hexual-in motive for trade has been eliminated. So that's what's going on in country one. So, so let me show now the domestic content of exports, and the intuition is actually fairly similar. So country one is the red line. What happens with the domestic content of exports in country one is the red line, and in country two it's the blue line. And then you see that it falls by more in country one, and this is largely due to the fact that country one is a smaller country for most of this transition period. But it's growing more rapidly as well. So so that you compare countries 1 and 2, and this pattern is consistent with the Johnson and Nogueira data that I alluded to at the beginning. The more rapidly growing country has the bigger fall in the domestic content of exports. But there's also this overshooting, and you see that the domestic content of exports actually rises after the trade integration stops. And again, it's due to those same two forces that I mentioned earlier. Country one is a bigger share of the world economy, so a greater share of its varieties are going to be just home produced, entirely home produced. So the domestic content of exports will be rising. And then this hexual-in motive for trade, which involves global value chains because of the way we set it up, where the stages are one is more capital intensive and the other is more labor intensive, that becomes less important. So, so that's another reason for this domestic content of exports to rise. And this type of pattern is empirically relevant because let me just show a picture for China's domestic content of exports. Again, in the interest of time, I'll skip South Korea. But the red line is the data from Johnson and Nogueira on value-added exports. And the black line is data from the OECD. They calculate their value-added exports, their domestic value-added embodied in exports a little bit differently, but you see for the overlapping periods, it's fairly similar. When you splice the two together, you get this, inverted J thing, where essentially since the early 2000s, the domestic content of exports in China has been rising. And I would argue it's partly because China's mass in the global economy has risen. And as their capital labor ratio has been catching up to the rest of the world, there's less of a motive for these hexual-in type forces. And that would matter, especially to the extent that different stages of production use different capital intensities. So just to summarize this asymmetric transition dynamics exercise, now with these asymmetric countries, hexual-in forces kick in. So the capital poor country imports the capital intensive stage and exports, in effect, the labor intensive stage. To the extent those forces are operating, you have greater efficiency gains and more capital accumulation than otherwise. I didn't emphasize this, but even though the richer country has no TFP growth, they're of course going to benefit from the trade integration, increased GVC participation, and the resulting capital accumulation. And then, as I mentioned, the pattern implied by our two countries in the model is consistent with this data, this pattern that Johnson and Nogueira showed. So the final thing I want to mention are the welfare gains. So here we compare, I'll just focus on the blue numbers. So we'll compare our model, this what's called baseline, to a dynamic Eaton-Korda model. And then the dynamic gains means the gains in both the transition dynamics and the steady state. And you see the gains are about 4 times larger. This is in the symmetric country case. And the asymmetric country case, it's basically the same, about 4 times larger. And then we do another exercise. This is the last thing I'll talk about, the second bullet point. So we compare our model to a similar roundabout production model where the trade in the final steady state, the import share of absorption in the final steady state, it's roughly 17%. It's the same in the two models. And we're just comparing the gains going from autarky to this similar import share of absorption. And then our welfare gains are twice as large as in this roundabout model. So that's it. Obviously, you know, this framework, there's a lot that could be done in terms of adding sectors, more linkages, more frictions. And then, of course, you know, we want to apply this framework for some quantitative analysis. So thank you.
Okay, great. So we will open this floor up for discussion. I see there's been a lot of things going on in the chat room. So if we want to kind of further discuss some of that with voices instead of texts, now would be the time.
Yeah, thank you. May I? Sorry, let me switch on my camera.
Hi, Alejandro.
Hi, Kei-Mu. Thank you. So I was asking a question in the chat. I think I expressed myself badly. So if we go to a stripped down Heck-Shirley model without Ricardian comparative advantage, without intermediate inputs, if you have initially different capital labor ratios in steady state and you reduce transport costs, the interest rate or the return to capital is going to shoot in different directions. It's going to increase for the capital abundant country, and it's going to go down for the labor abundant country, which would create divergence in the capital accumulation path. So this is not happening in the model here. I imagine it's because of the Ricardian and the intermediate input structure that you have.
Yeah.
So I imagine that this depends on parameter values, right?
Yeah. So we need to connect our paper to. So you were referring to one of your past papers, which was one of my favorite papers.
Thank you. No, I did
it.
Yeah, sure. And, I mean, self-citation was not meant here, but
no, but
I'm wondering about the economics here.
Yeah. No. So I'm just thinking on the fly here, but remind me, in your framework, were you in the Edgeworth box or the FPE set, or were you not in the FPE set?
I'm not referring to that paper. I'm referring to a paper with transport costs. So there's no, think of a two-country model. You have a continuum of goods with different intermediate, with where the capital intensity varies with the index Z and the continuum 0, 1. If you reduce transport costs in that model, then actually you're gonna have divergence in returns.
Yeah.
So, but this should be here in your model too, is because you have
that's right.
Different capital intensities in these stages. Your alpha, I'm referring to your alpha S.
That's right. So it should be implicit somewhere in this diagram. So
I see the investment rate fall in this graph.
I think what we want to do then is an exercise to make it cleaner. We should get rid of the TFP growth. Should have the two countries start out with the different capital labor ratios and only have the trade integration, and then see what happens.
Yeah.
So then I think it becomes a lot closer to.
But so you have TFP growth here.
Yeah, this one has the TFP growth. That's the source of all this catch-up right here.
Okay, so this must be washing away the effect that I'm talking about, for example.
I think so. The convergence is kind of independent of where you start. So, I'm not familiar with your paper, but if there's like a small open economy kind of thing going on, if you don't have diminishing returns to capital, then maybe that's kind of the thing that you get. But here, in the steady state, the MPK has to just
No,
the
if you
inverse
have,
of the
if,
discount factor, and that's going to
yes,
anchor
yeah. I'm
everything,
sorry,
right?
I've missed that you had productivity growth. I mean, if there's productivity growth and there's transfer costs, I imagine yes that you are going to have convergence. Sorry, yeah. Okay, it's clear. Thanks. Sorry, I was unclear before, Mike.
No, thanks for your comment, though. Yeah.
But we should do this exercise that tries to essentially replicate what you had before.
Kei-Mu.
Yeah.
Back to the first figure you had with the 4 different value chains. I thought this figure would be the way to, you know, answer George's initial questions and some of those questions about what's really different about this untrust Di-Guattari model, because I think I can't quite articulate it, but it kind of has this feel that there's certain ways to trade that are very low trade cost, and then those are the ones you get into first, and then later there are these very high trade cost ways to trade. That's not in the standard model. So there's something there that's almost like the equivalent of some sort of heterogeneity and trade costs across different activities or different trade elasticities. Somehow I feel like you could deal with those initial questions using this figure.
Yeah, I agree with you, Sam.
Because I think this model really, I think the untrust Di-Guattari really does generate some new stuff, but it's a little, it's kind of subtle, so it's not easy to put your hand around. But I think this might get at it.
Yeah. So
yeah, I mean,
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kei-Mu.
no, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, Sam, I think you're kind of spot on. So I think, you know, a lot of the questions that came up earlier when we were just looking at the sort of ACR equivalent was, you know, you kind of have this lambda share raised to some theta elasticity. That's your gains from trade. And so, you know, it's the share raised to the elasticity that is the gains. And then, you know, so you can say, okay, well, if I have a different model, you know, it gives me a different share. I can always adjust the elasticity to get the same, you know, calculation, right? But I guess the subtle point is that, you know, as you're reducing trade costs and these lambda shares are changing, right? They're changing at different rates with the trade costs. And so, you know, if we're thinking about moving the trade cost from 3 to 2, you know, that's going to generate a big change in lambda in the GVC model and a little change and basically almost no change in pi in the standard EK model. So even if you were to make the appropriate adjustment on the trade elasticity, the gains are going to look different, you know, across the spectrum of trade costs. Once you get to free trade, then, you know, maybe the stuff kind of looks similar with the appropriate adjustment, but it's all these intermediate cases that are going to be different. And so I think your point about, yeah, you know, using these, this kind of information is, you know, what's happening along the way, you know, before you get all the way to free trade, you can kind of see how these lambda shares are adjusting through these different chains. And that's actually what's generating and that's potentially something you can, you know, measure in the data to separately identify the theta versus the lambda.
I'm going to jump back in here, which is, am I hearing you that what's different is that the elasticity is kind of like varying with the level of trade? Is that doesn't seem like that could be the source of any seriously different gains once you kind of got the average elasticity right.
No, so I think, okay, so one, I think, yeah, so I think one implication is that, yes, the elasticity varies with the, you know, is kind of dependent on the level of the current trade barrier, but it's not necessarily that that's the source of the gains. It's more that in this GVC model, trade starts taking off at lower trade costs, or I'm sorry, at higher trade costs. Higher. And so you'll start realizing gains from trade sooner before you even get close to free trade.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that comes back to the discussion on trade elasticities, right? I mean, if we kind of set these models, I mean, let's throw out all the capital stuff for a second, right? If we set these models up so that trade's responding the same amount, I guess I just don't see how we're going to end up getting like bigger gains in one model versus the other. It just in the end, you're going to have like some static equation, which is related to the, how, the domestic expenditure share. And as long as I'm kind of matching that up across the models, it just seems.
Yeah,
like,
no, that's a fair point. If you were to match up, let's say, okay, but let's say we're kind of restricting ourselves, tying our hands to just have a constant data parameter, okay? And so then the question is, at which level of trade costs do you want to kind of equalize the thetas across the two models? Once you do that at one point, it's not going to sort of equalize it at every level of trade costs. That's the point. So like Kei-Mu's answer earlier on was, okay, we can kind of look at the free trade scenario, and we could pick a different theta for the spider model so that it gives us the same gains from trade as in the GBC model. Okay, but now suppose instead of going all the way to free trade, we just go from trade costs from 8 to 4. Now if you want to put them on equal footing there, you need to make a different adjustment to the theta. So now if you make your theta adjustment kind of dependent on the size of trade costs, well, then you're kind of free to do whatever you want to begin with, and then it's hard to.
But I guess if the trade elasticity is kind of like the average from like free trade from like autarky to free trade across the two models, then kind of in total they have to be the same. It just could be a little bit different early in one and a little bit less later on. I guess which is not such a big deal.
No, see, George, I disagree with that. Suppose let's take an extreme case where all the trade growth in a model comes with a trade cost go from 10% to 0. The gains have to be less than when you have a trade model where you're getting a significant amount of trade. When the trade goes from 5, the trade costs go from 400% to 300%. I think the path matters.
I guess.
And this kind of shows up here.
I was trying to keep it the same across. So I've done work with like with time varying trade elasticities, and if you have just curvature in the trade elasticity and you're kind of matching the average, you don't really get much of a kick out of anything. Now it could be like if you're kind of targeting the trade elasticity in one region, this I think was Mallett's and Redding's point, you're going to kind of be wrong about the rest of the trade elasticity. But I don't think that was the point that you guys were making. It was just I wasn't quite sure. But so it's really about these different trade elasticities along the whole path that you guys are focused on. Is that what I'm supposed to take from this? That the Antrasti Cortari gives you?
Yeah, I would go back to the, and to reinforce Sam's point that any kind of roundabout model, there's really only two possibilities, like 1, 1 and 2, 2. That's it. And so you've got this dashed line, and that, from this thing, you can infer directly the import share of absorption, the gains from trade, etc. But here it's a little more complicated because there's the 4 different chains and they rise or decline at different rates. And so the gains as well as the trade elasticities are just going to be, just more nonlinear as a function of the trade costs.
So is this more like the OSA point that you need to know, like when you have different elasticities in different industries, that it sort of depends upon like the trade share and the kind of least elastic industry? I guess I'm still kind of just I should read it more.
Yeah, maybe it's connected to that.
Maybe I'll stop asking questions. Yeah. It's not clear. It's not clear to me the way that it was kind of laid out, that having like trade cost varying trade elasticity that varies with the trade cost gives you fundamentally like a different result than a model with a constant trade elasticity when the two things are kind of averaged out. So that would be useful for me to sort of work out, or you guys for me.
Yeah, so we could do that, but there are enough free parameters in a roundabout. If you gave yourself enough degrees of freedom in a roundabout model, I'm sure you could match these key things. So I guess one point is, and this would relate to the quantitative work, is how you're going to discipline these parameters. And then if you're choosing to discipline them to match some data moments, then of course, then you could start to get different outcomes from the two frameworks.
I have a very basic question, and I missed this very early on. Why, the slide we're looking at, why does it say without GVC, trade imposes infinite trade costs in stage 1? I mean, you could still have a spider model. In our model, we had intermediates, they just weren't specific to, and they could have been imported.
I mean, this is how, so the way we got the no GVC model is we just took our GVC model and then imposed these infinite trade costs for stage 1. And then, so basically it would, then the only two outcomes would be this chain and then this chain.
Yeah, but that, see, I mean, why not just have it be, the first stage could be from anywhere. It wouldn't have to be, I mean, it could be the composite. In ours framework, the intermediate was just the local composite. So it would just be the average import share for the economy rather than 0 or 1 in the GVC model. That just seems a more natural comparison. Because you've basically said the EK model or this doesn't have any intermediate trade. And your
Well,
model does.
this, so right, the version of the EK model in this exercise is, as you said, it doesn't have intermediate trade, but the path of the two chains, you know, it's going to be the same whether you have intermediates or not. So this dashed line is going to be the same even if for the beta less than 1 case. You know, it's going to, you know, of course it's going to be either this one or this one. And then the change in it as the trade cost decline, it's going to be the same.
Yeah, somehow though, it just seems that the global value chain model, you now have 4 ways of getting something instead of 2.
Right.
And that's going to increase welfare right away. And since 3 of those are going to involve trade, there's going to be more trade.
Right. No, that's the, I think that is the heart of the intuition, just that.
Kei-Mu, I thought that Antras and Di Gortari did incorporate what Jonathan was talking about in there. I mean, I thought they did have just this kind of general purpose intermediate as a, just as a rope to kind of show that what they did wasn't the same as that. They kind of, is that so, that's so easily added to the basic model.
Yeah, so you could add roundabout. You could add a general purpose intermediate here, in addition to this specialized intermediate. You know, and as I mentioned, this paper that I have with Eunhee, it's a static model, but we do that. We have that there. So.
Thanks. I have to go teach. So I'm gonna...
See you, Sam.
Yeah, thanks.
I mean, I guess I'm getting bogged down with the Antras Di Gortari paper, which is not your paper. And just trying to understand like how for the same movements in trade, we get much bigger gains in one model versus the other. But I think you guys weren't saying that for the same movements in trade, you get different gains from trade, right? I think you were saying that we get more movements in trade in this model. And then you guys appended the capital accumulation stuff to it, which then kind of magnifies everything, right? That in the long run. But it would help me to kind of really have like the extra kick from whatever extra kick you're getting from Di Gortari Antras, a little bit more spelled out for the layperson.
Yeah. So I have this. I did this simple example in this border effect paper where I took a DFS model and I only allowed 2 production paths. So stage 1 had to be made in the home country. And then the only issue is where is stage 2 made? And it could be made in the home country or the foreign country. And this is from the perspective of the home consumer. So there are only 2 production paths, like where the entire good is made at home or where you had the back and forth trade, like stage 1 in the US, stage 2 in Mexico, and then it comes back to the US. So then you can, you just force that those are the only options. Then you can analyze it in the usual DFS framework, and you can compute the trade elasticity. And it's tied to the share of stage 1 production and stage 2 goods. There's this, and you do see this magnified effect, on top of the usual elasticity.
So let me,
What I don't know is whether that carries over to the Antras and Durgotari framework. That's what I don't know because of this additional assumption they made. Anyway, Mike.
Yeah, let me do a different take on this. Is, the core mechanism, forget about trade. It's about, how it works through the price index. That's what's moving the real return on capital. And so and I also think for the welfare gains, that's what we really need to understand is exactly how the price index is changing. And I'm going to give out some the envelope theorem kind of logic is just like if there's like a 1% change in the trade costs, then I just weight it by the appropriate share of stuff that's being imported. Now that could be different in your model versus like the standard one sector model, but I just take the 1% change in the trade costs weighted by the share, and that has to tell me how much the price index changed. That's just like envelope theorem off of the planning problem. And so forget about how much trade is going on. I think thinking through that kind of stuff might help a bit more than kind of getting, perhaps you can circle back to the trade elasticity stuff. And I think what Jonathan was saying is exactly right. It's like, it looks like it's opening up far more options. But I think the first step is actually just tracing out, fix the, change the trade costs and kind of trace it out into prices. And that's what that's my kind of advice on this. It's a shame that we're spending all this time talking about Durgotari and Antras when it's a published paper. But we should understand this. But I think but I think for you too, the core, at the end of the day, it's about the price index and how it affects the price of capital or the return on capital. So that's also why I'd focus on that.
Yeah, thanks for that suggestion. I think it's even relevant in the static case too, though. But obviously even more so in the dynamic case.
Yeah, for sure. That's how welfare is manifested in the model in the static cases through the price index too. Yeah. But here it's everything is always the price index doing this double duty right here.
Yeah.
The second thing about this is more just something you might want to check is Ravi had this paper with Paul Gome and I can't remember who else, but they were trying to measure the marginal product to capital.
Yeah.
And one question is could you see a move in the marginal product to capital in the US with changes in trade? Just, I don't know. You look at trade expanded so quickly in early 2000s with China. I'm just wondering if you could just kind of see some of that stuff.
Yeah, no, that right. That would be an implication that would be worth looking at, definitely.
Yeah, Mike's exactly right on that. The first order effects are always the change in trade costs. Once you kind of control for the same trade share. And then now we're kind of having this discussion about this other paper where it's all the second order effect about whether you get the elasticity is a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. But the first order effect is what Mike was talking about. And that's why we kind of start these models always in the same spots, that the first order effect is the same across all the models.
But the question is the first order effect the same? That's
If we start with the same trade share, it has to be, right? Because it's basically, you're changing the, if you have the same trade share, same trade elasticity.
Well, so I think that's a subtle difference because, okay, so in kind of the one stage model, like the trade share is pretty clearly defined. It's just you import only in one stage, you take that as a share of your absorption or whatever, right? And that's your kind of import share. Here, there's more than you can kind of rearrange the spending on the different chains in many different ways so that you get the same total import to absorption share. But the different combinations of these chains are going to have different implications for welfare.
Yeah, and with intermediates, your a given change in trade costs blows up as there's more intermediation. The elasticities are different, so you do have to be a bit careful with that comparison.
But I think that's exactly right. I mean, because it's like, you think if there's multiple, that's kind of Jonathan and Mike's saying, is if there's multiple chains, you kind of have to link them all together to think about, I change the price upstream.
Yeah.
If I change the train costs upstream, I got a share into down next stream and then a share. And then like I think that it's kind of easier to think about like in like the Caliendo Pero, or, I guess the Roundabout too, you just gross stuff up.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm kind of struggling with is, I'm super sympathetic to everything George is saying, but it's like, what is the share here? Like, I kind of not sure about that. And that's why I'd like to know more. That's why I think thinking about just this, like that kind of direct effect kind of stuff, it might be a bit more straightforward to attacking the question.
I wonder if part of the problem comes from trade being in gross terms and production being measured in value-added terms, because I think this economy, Holden's theorem holds, right? There's nothing here that would cause it to fail. So what's important is the impact of any particular part of the economy is just it's
share.
Domar share.
Yeah, it's Domar share.
Right. And so it doesn't really matter how you go trace all these chains through the economy, as long as you get the Domar weight done properly. That should tell you the impact on the final product. But the thing we do with trade is we follow the gross trade around. I don't know if that makes any sense, but
yeah, then what's the right, like, how do you construct the correct Domar weight here in this model? That's what.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the issue, right? So like, if you take a GVC, suppose the data you're looking at in real life came from a GVC kind of setting, right? You could take that and you could put it into, the kind of spider setting easily, because you just match, oh, well, here's total value added, here's total gross output. That's the parameter I put for the roundabout. And, then you're kind of done right away, right? But if you're going in the other direction, it's not so obvious, right? So if you tell me what's the intermediate share in, in gross production, and then I want to go to a GVC setting, and, there's more than one ways to rig the GVC model to get the same kind of aggregate shares that you're looking at. The same thing with imports to absorption, right? So it's not a one-for-one mapping between the settings. So it's not obvious what is, you can always go from, you can take GVC data and, fit that into a kind of a spider model. But the reverse direction is, there's infinitely many ways to go the other way. So that's kind of I think that's essentially, if I understand what Mike is saying, this is essentially the, the issue, right? Because you would need to know that mapping if you want to get the Domar weight, if you will. But
now it reminds me of Descartes' job market paper about how he's trying to kind of, it's hard to understand, but he was trying to piece together something about how, you know, at the firm, like literally every point along the chain interrelated. But
So I guess one other thing about this paper that Kei-Mu briefly mentioned was, we're talking a lot about the welfare implications and the effect of GVC on kind of aggregate outcomes, but it's the other direction that's kind of interesting here as well, is that as the macro economy is kind of evolving and capital is accumulating, that's also feeding back into the GVC patterns, right? So in the asymmetric country case where the capital accumulation is growing faster in the poorer country, over time, what that's doing is that's moving that country away from downstream and more upstream, right? So the countries are kind of like shifting or changing their specialization across these stages. And so this kind of feedback from the macro aggregates into the GVCs, that's also kind of, maybe this is a second order effect in terms of welfare, but that's also,
I agree. I think from a positive standpoint, that's great. Like, I think that's super interesting. It's exactly like this idea, like you're talking about China is, China, we thought about China, when I was a kid, China was doing crappy stuff or like low end stuff. And now you open up the Wall Street Journal and they're talking about making lithium batteries and Tesla cars, and or you buy a Volvo from China. This is not, they've moved up, and this is kind of, I think that's kind of an interesting, positive, issue that your model can take on. So
I guess, why is that about the GVC as opposed to saying there's different sectors with different capital intensities? That would come through in a model with different sectors and different capital.
Sure, that's just heteroline. You could do that with
So what was the GVC that was kind of extra there? How is GVC kind of making a bigger feedback than you would normally get?
In terms of that particular channel? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, you're getting, one thing I like about our setting is when you think about what's the metaphor for China and joining the global trading environment. It's that they focused on labor-intensive stages, and then the rest of the world did the capital-intensive stages. So our framework actually directly can get at that. And then, in addition, as both Mikes were saying, as China accumulates capital over time, it becomes more similar to the rest of the world. The motive for that type of trade diminishes. And this might be in part a reason why China's trade share of GDP has fallen over the last 10 to 15 years.
It would be useful to kind of draw out the specialness of the GVC with the conventional hexagon forces. If it's really just because you're finding like a bigger gain from trade from the GVCs, that's one thing. If it's really there's something kind of unique to having model GVCs, then it'd be nice to sort of draw that out a little bit more clearly. So.